Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are back with the final installment of folks who are working on transactional interpretations of quantum mechanics, which we have dealt with extensively on this show, starting with our meetup with Carver Mead, who was a Caltech professor. I guess he's technically still there in an emeritus capacity, but he worked with Richard Feynman and tried to understand how it is that light unfolds, not just considering one atom shooting these little photon thingies out into space, but how two atoms are always necessary for light and how they both play a role. And to follow up on that, we recently this year had John Kramer from the University of Washington, and we've talked to Ruth Kastner as well. And today we have Andreas Schlatter, who has worked with Ruth Kastner on developing an extension of the transactional idea to gravity. And I think that's really fascinating because there's increasing evidence piling up that gravity and light seem to be in some way very similar processes, if not two sides of the exact same coin. And so we're going to unpack that today. And Andreas has a really interesting story of how he found his way to these ideas, which was quite circuitous. He did all of his original training and PhD postdocs in the heart of the physics establishment, and then moved away, becoming a bit dissatisfied with the detached mathematical approach to fundamental reality, and worked in finance for many years before essentially finding himself in the position to retire and actually tackle some of the problems that had been bothering him over the years. So we have a really cool conversation lined up for you where we pick apart not only how these theories work, but also a unique journey to discovery.
And I think that the reason these conversations about the transactional interpretation are so important is because it gives us a way of considering that there is a different way of looking at the same set of data. The possibility that is most popular right now in the world is to create progressively spookier and stranger models, but the transactional interpretation offers what I think is a more rational approach. And there is a little bit of a departure from pure space-time, uh,
Pure material atomics?
yeah, pure material atomics, because we really spend a lot of time dealing with this question of the Hilbert space and the question of where are these events actually happening and what is the difference between measuring the event and perceiving the event and its actual occurrence, which I think that we probably, I wouldn't say disagree with Andreas upon, but would have different language for discussing if it was just us talking about it about material atomics. But despite all of that, it was a really fascinating conversation that spanned everything from physics to finance back to the derivation of big G.
Yeah, I would say fundamentally, just like most of the establishment physics community, Andreas is at heart an empiricist, and he wants to start with what the measurements tell us and really consider that the basis which needs to be explained. I think that's totally reasonable. Of course, if you've been listening to the show for a while, Nasty and I find ourselves more in the camp of Descartes and the rationalists who are really trying to make proposals for what the underlying materials could be doing to give us those measurements. And we're quite comfortable with hypothetical entities so long as they can be understood in the rational space. But that's really just a worldview division, and you probably find yourself in one of those two camps. So open your mind up and try to hang in there as we peg our understanding of the universe to this mathematical, empirical understanding of the universe. Transactional interpretation is really intriguing, and it's the closest thing I've seen to an understanding of light that makes sense in my brain.
If you like what we do on the podcast, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. By giving us a couple dollars a month, you ensure that we never have to take advertisements, we never have to take sponsors. We will always be able to maintain full editorial control over what it is that we do on this show, and it gives you a direct line to us, because we meet once a week with our patrons. We have a chat on Sunday mornings where we get together, we talk about whatever people are thinking about, the ideas they're curious about, and it's a really cool group of people one of the highlights of my week, and so I hope to see you there. If you don't like Patreon, that's fine. We have Bitcoin, we have PayPal, we have Wise. We're selling t-shirts at cost down below. We're currently working on even more t-shirt designs, and so keep an eye out for those. You can like, comment, subscribe. You can find us on Discord, on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram, anywhere that you are on the internet. The Demystify Side podcast is as well. Tell your friends, spread the word, and enjoy the conversation.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Side podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm a mathematician by training. I studied mathematics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology 30 years ago. I got my PhD there as well. And my major subject already at that time was in theoretical physics. And I did some work in Young-Mills theory. I studied the heat flow in four manifolds. I then did postdoctoral work. I had a research position at Princeton University in the US, where I actually continued working on the Young-Mills flow. I studied topological impacts to the equation and to the solutions and regularity. And I then decided to leave the academic world.
All right, before we get out of the academic world, could you just explain the Yang-Mills conception a little bit, at least in some surface terms, without getting too deep into the mathematics? Like what's unique about that approach, and what sort of problems does it attempt to solve?
Yes. Well, the Yang-Mills equations are actually a very compact and general form for the Maxwell equations. So it's actually nothing else. You take the curvature on a vector bundle, and you somehow define the differential operator on that curvature. You set it 0. And you get the Yang-Mills equations, and you get solutions to the Yang-Mills equations, which would actually be solutions to the Maxwell equations if you are just in four-dimensional flat Euclidean space.
So is it a more efficient way to handle particular solutions to the Maxwell equation?
Yeah, like why would you use Yang-Mills instead of Maxwell?
Well, you do it on manifolds. And what's especially then as a mathematician, you find that these notions like curvature on a vector bundle allow you, of course, to give or to indicate certain topological classes and topological properties of the underlying manifold. It was the time in the 80s when Simon Donaldson found his exotic structures on four manifolds, and their instantons, special solutions, to these equations played an important role. So people were interested in finding solutions and asked, are there solutions or not? And then it's a natural way of actually taking a heat equation. You start with a connection and you let the heat flow. You look at the heat flow. And if you're lucky and you get regular solutions, you will eventually, at infinity, get a Yang-Mills connection, right? So
there's parallels in the way that these electromagnetic systems dissipate that's related to heat flow, and I assume diffusion as well.
Well, I have to be fair and say that I was, as soon as you hear heat flow, I was working on the elliptic case. So actually real physics takes a Lorentz manifold. So it's hyperbolic. I worked with a Riemann manifold. So my equations were elliptic. Of course, is a big difference to the physical case, I have to admit. So it was more or less the idea, to have a proxy of the physical case, because we were more interested in topological structures of the manifold than in physics at the time.
So basically, mathematical extensions, really, like new ways to approach the problem mathematically.
Yes. But of course, it introduced me to the world of quantum fields, because that's actually the mathematics of quantum field theory. Right? You have connections, you have vector bundles, you have sections on these bundles, and that's how I got into physics and interested into physics. Right? And that interest remains strongly. I studied on my own. I studied quantum field theory, all these things, and I also got at that time interested in the general relativity, because it's a special gauge theory as well. It's a tangent bundle, right? Instead of an arbitrary vector bundle, you have the tangent bundle on a manifold, and the connections are the gamma, the Christoffel symbols. So there are intimate connections between general relativity and Young-Mills theories, of course. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the parallels between heat flow and various other physical processes. Mainly, and it's really interesting to hear that there's parallels with electrodynamics, because it's always fascinated me that heat flow was originally developed as a fluid. Of course, people for fairly modern times, I believe the 1800s, were working under the impression that heat was a fluid which was flowing. And of course it proved not to be the case, because, it was discovered through different friction experiments, principally cannon boring, that you could generate infinite quantities of this fluid as long as you kept the drill in motion, right? And so this became untenable physically, despite the fact that the mathematics were appropriate to treat it as a fluid. And I think in some sense, the way that we model electricity is also some sort of magical fluid, where there's these little electron thingies that are flowing, but not quite at the same speed of the current. And it gets into paradoxical territory really fast, but it really opens the mind up to, hey, perhaps there's something going on at the atomic level which is analogous to heat, which we, of course, now understand as a particular motion of the atom, which we were masquerading as a fluid flow because that was mathematically appropriate. And so it seems really intriguing to me that electrodynamic processes could also be thought of this way, because perhaps we'll at one point uncover some particular motion of the atom which is responsible for electrodynamics itself.
Okay, yeah. Well, there are, of course, connections. These flows, or heat-like flows, were also of interest. I remember at the time there was the Ricci flow, which, of course, became very famous recently when the Poincare conjecture was solved. And that was a similar ansatz, just on a different bundle. And all these heat flow, equations were used to find solutions. Then you had to study regularity of the solutions. And there is an intimate connection between the topology of the underlying space and the solutions to these equations. That's quite interesting. And amazing connections also to symmetry. If you have certain symmetries in the initial connection, you suddenly get global existence. So that was highly interesting. We called it geometric flows, where you actually have. Sorry, yes.
Oh no, go ahead.
Where you actually have all these, all the different mathematical tools come together, analysis, topology, to actually study a topic.
And so when you're studying these systems and understanding the way that the interactions lead to the solution of the equations, are you also trying to trace it back to physical reality, or are you mostly working on it in the theoretical and the abstract space as an exercise in developing mathematics that might one day be applicable to some kind of physical system?
Well, at the time when I was active in that field 35 years ago, I clearly did it as a mathematical exercise. I have to be quite frank. I was thrilled by the idea that there was physics in the vicinity, and you could also apply it to physics. But to me, it was and to most of my colleagues, I suppose, it was a purely mathematical exercise. And as I said, you were rather interested in topological solutions or in topological properties of underlying spaces than in physical solutions to some physical equations. I have to admit. But of course, if you are a physicist, then that's certainly a difference between a mathematician and a physicist. If you're a physicist, you should actually come the other way, I guess. You should have nature And then you should really make sure that what you do is a model of nature. I never worked at the time with a model of nature.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, this seems wholly unique to me in the ontological universe, or maybe epistemological universe of how we study things. Like, I can't think of another discipline where people are only interested in the generation of abstract tools that might one day be useful. It's often the other way around in engineering, where there's a discrete physical problem that needs to be solved technologically, and then the tools are developed to solve that problem. Can you think of anything like that? Is there any other place where people are working in this purely abstract space to develop these intellectual tools which might have some importance later?
My first thought is maybe literary criticism, where you have these complex structures of the way that you interpret language in literary works, and you see various veils of meaning, and you analyze texts through different lenses in order to be able to understand what is actually being said.
Yes.
And it's very imprecise, obviously. You're not getting to 10 decimal places of meaning, but I think that the venture is spiritually similar, where you're taking something that is abstract and you're doing your best to map it in some way that is useful. I guess where the analogy breaks down is that in literary criticism, it's presumably useful for the immediate world right now, because you're analyzing some text structurally and you're using it to read into the structures of society that have given rise to it.
You're still studying something that's already extant, right?
Yeah, mathematics is weird because it seems to be this deep fascination with numerical relationships. And the most superficial version of it, don't be offended, is numerology. I see people doing this all the time. They're like, the number 72 shows up everywhere. And you're like, does that have any meaning? And they're like, no, but 72 is everywhere. You're like,
you're actually making a very interesting point. I'm just reading right now about Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer. And it's interesting how these people at that time had an approach to nature, and it was a mixture. You mentioned numerology. They, on the one hand, they were deeply scientific, as we would understand it today. So they took the data, they did calculations. But on the other hand, they were deeply, almost mystical. Right? They believed in numerology. They believed in, so for instance, he believed that the 5 platonic bodies actually were represented in the sky, and that the orbits of the planets all fit into these platonic bodies. And
they couldn't let go of the circle, right? Famously, they wanted the circle. It was so perfect, right? How could the planets obey anything other than the circle?
Absolutely. And I mean, he went so far when he realized that obviously it was no circle. He knew the ellipse very well, but then he thought, well, it can't be the ellipse, because otherwise the Greeks would have found that much earlier. It must be something more complicated. So he lost years because he did not believe that it could be the ellipse, because it was too easy. And they were deeply, deeply actually almost kept and kept back by that belief that the circle was perfect. And even Newton, right? Newton was mystically, and he believed in alchemy, and he believed in numerology. He studied the Bible to find out all these things. So
I think it was not without, I mean, to be fair to those guys, like, I think that the circle had produced magnificent revelations in the past, in particular in terms of, who was it, Aristarchus, who measured the earth famously?
Yes.
This was basic circle trigonometry, like simple 8th grade level stuff, but it was so simple and brilliant that you could explain it to somebody at a bar, I'm sure. And so there's something really, really magnificent about understanding the circle and how it applies in all of these different scales and so forth, and how it was responsible for some of these fundamental discoveries, right? Because once you can measure the Earth, then you can start to create, this system, right? The solar system and so forth. Of course, they updated that over the years as well. But it does have some predictive magnificence to it, the circle. And so I can
Yes.
see why they wanted things
Absolutely.
to obey the circular dynamics.
Yes. Well, actually, mathematics does have this deep puzzling. It's like a miracle that these notions and these definitions actually work out so well, even in nature. I mean, wasn't it Eugene Wigner who said this strange, I mean, puzzling,
Unreasonable effectiveness of
unreasonable
mathematics.
effectiveness, exactly, of mathematics, and indeed it is puzzling. And then you get very thrilled by defining and finding these notions, and then of course you tend to believe, many do, that mathematics is out there. It's something to be discovered, and it's very, very deep. And of course, then you're close of connecting it to the beyond and
very Platonic, actually.
Very
This
Platonic,
idealization,
exactly.
right? There's some
Very
ideal
Platonic.
form that we just need to
Yeah.
figure it out. Like it's there because
Yeah.
it's this simple, perfect form that
Yeah.
must have pre-existed our arrival on its knowledge.
It's
Yeah.
so interesting though, because theoretical mathematics departs from reality. And so if we're talking about there being something out there, normally I would expect that means that you would go somewhere, look at an event, and then the mathematics would emerge from that event. And so you would say that it is out there in the sense that you have observed it. But there's something about the practice of theoretical mathematics that departs fully from the physical world and cloaks itself entirely in abstractions. And
Yes.
so as you get deeper and deeper into it, you're discovering relationships within a logical system that are consistent and perhaps even surprising. The part that I have never fully understood, and maybe you can help me explain, is why people find those relationships to be profound and meaningful.
Well, I guess it's just because, first of all, when you find these notions, definitions, and you suddenly find out that what you can do with it, just mathematically, right? You can develop spaces, infinite dimensional spaces. You suddenly find solutions to equations which before you couldn't even dream of. I think it has something to do with the tremendous power these definitions do have. To me, the best example was always functional theory, so complex analysis. I mean, you take the notion of a holomorphic function and you get everything, right? It's analytic. You can integrate. You can do all the stuff with a holomorphic function. It's automatically, it's the most regular thing you can only hope for. And as long as you do real analysis, it's very cumbersome to find out whether the function is analytic, whether the extra Taylor series converges. And as soon as you go into the complex numbers and you find that definition of holomorphic or continuous, or differentiable, not even continuously because it's automatically continuous, differentiable function, you get the whole realm where you can actually do research. And they did research at the time, 100 years ago or more, when they found this out. It's amazing. It's a whole world out there. I think that's what's so appealing in a way. And then people, or you believe that there is a world beyond out there. You can't measure it. It's beyond our experience. It's merely, and it's pure, right? It's pure thought. But then, of course, there is the other view. People say, well, it's just an invention. It's just a construction, a human construction. And it's sourced out of sensomotorical impressions, which we get. And you cannot disconnect the body or senses from your brain. And it's actually no wonder, because there is a world out there. It is regular. It has some regularities. We are made of the same stuff. We belong to that world. No wonder that, and we have access to that world, first of all, by our senses. No wonder that we get sensomotorical intuitions that our brains then work out into these wonderful, as we believe, abstract definitions. But they're nothing more than a reflection of the regularities which we perceive in the world by our daily sensorical, by our experience, if you will. That's the other view, right? And people who are in the Platonic realm are very offended sometimes if somebody from the other realm talks to them. So it's quite interesting. You had the famous logician called Gödel, right? He was a deeply Platonic-minded person. He was a Platonist. He believed in the reality of all these things. That was a good example. And he lived among all these positivist people, these positivist philosophers in Vienna, who were just of a different opinion, right? But
what was I've heard positivists before, but I don't know. I couldn't off the top of my head tell you what their philosophy was.
it was a so-called Vienna circle because it met in Vienna. There was the mathematician Hans Hahn. There was the economist Hans Neurath. There were people like Josef Weigel. These were philosophers, and actually the main character was a philosopher called Moritz Schlick. He was a professor of philosophy at Vienna University. He wrote a very good book about general relativity, which even Albert Einstein praised very heavily at the time. And they met, and they believed that it was a fight against metaphysics. They believed that things should be logical. There was logics, and there were experiments, right? And the world was just logically and experimentally perceivable. And anything else which you couldn't test or which was not accessible to logics was just fantasy, and you should not care about. And one of their heroes was, of course, Einstein, because he logically, it was general relativity. That was a perfect example. And another hero was, of course, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, who said, and I quote freely, of what you can speak, you should speak, and of what you can't, you shouldn't. So just shut up. If there is something you can't speak of, just don't speak of it. Just don't talk if there is nothing behind. So it was an attack against metaphysics.
And so
Gödel
is like there's something else that can't be spoken of, but is there and must be considered.
Absolutely. So he was not, in his heart, he was not part of them. He joined their meetings. Obviously, he very rarely said anything, but he thought a lot. He thought a lot.
I mean, for me, the most disturbing part about this paradigm that we're dancing around, which is A, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and B, the infinite possibility of abstraction in mathematics, is that oftentimes history has proved out that very, very beautiful mathematics can be developed which are highly predictive of physical systems but turn out to be completely wrong. And I gave one example earlier with the fluid flow of heat. But another obvious one that we've touched on is the Ptolemaic system of the epicycles, which was highly predictive. And it was, in some sense, a really brilliant preview of something like a Fourier transform in the future, right? Where you deconvolve something into its very simple waves, or in this case, circles. But circles can be approximated as sine waves, of course. And so you have a system that is mathematically elegant and highly predictive of a physical phenomenon, but totally wrong. That's really disturbing. And that's where the interpretations start to become a real thorn in the side of the physicist, because when it comes to interpretations of something like quantum mechanics, oftentimes the physicists say, well, that's not our problem. That's somebody else's problem. That's a philosophical problem. The problem is there's very few philosophers, outright philosophers, who are, equipped with, let's say, the logical language, the mathematics to even evaluate the physics in a way to also speak the philosophical language to address the problem. And so interpretations of physics, especially quantum physics, end up in this no man's land where almost nobody is really fully equipped to deal with that issue. But at the same time, it's one of the biggest and most difficult problems of the whole intellectual universe, as far as I can tell.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's quite interesting to see the development, for instance, of Albert Einstein. You know, when he was younger, he had great physical intuition, no doubt. When you read how he was thinking of running behind a light ray, and then what happens if I catch it? What do I experience? So he was actually driven by concrete physical thought experiments. That was his strength, right? Either a real experiment, but if you couldn't do a real experiment, let's try a thought experiment. And he found his theories and the mathematics, well, it followed. He was a good mathematician by all means. But mathematics was actually, it came after the intuition. He had deep intuitions. When you read his work and his letters, later that changed. He started inventing mathematics and tried to somehow achieve something, namely the combination of gravity and electrodynamics. But it was like, oh, let's think of a new mathematical model and then let's see whether it works. It was just in a way the other way around.
What was the change? When did this happen?
I don't know, really. Yeah. I think, he was first very skeptical when Minkowski introduced the 4 dimensions. He said that now he couldn't understand his own theory anymore. But then, of course, he found out when he was working on the general theory of relativity, and he was at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology here in Zurich, that he needed mathematics. So he had a good friend who was a professor at the university, at the Swiss Federal Institute. It was Marcel Grossmann. He studied with him together, so they knew each other very well. And he needed Grossmann, and Grossmann was a professor of mathematics, and he was specialized in differential geometry. So he knew all about Riemannian geometry. And actually, Grossmann helped Einstein quite a lot to get into the mathematics. And I think it was at that time when Einstein started appreciating the power of mathematics. That's my view. I don't know. But
didn't Grossmann appear on some of the first relativity publications,
yes,
if I recall correctly?
Yes,
so he's kind of the man in the wings. It's really interesting when you dig into a lot of the heroes across time, how you'll find this person often in the shadows, who doesn't get the same legendary status, but seems to have
he missed out, if you will. Yes, he definitely did.
But perhaps he preferred it that way. I don't know.
Well, he died early.
I see.
Tragically, he was very ill, and then he died quite early. But still, yes. And I think it was at that moment when Einstein realized that mathematics could be very powerful. And maybe that was later on what drove him to actually do more and more abstract work in a way. And as we know, he never got nowhere as regards unification of electromagnetism and gravitation. He did other things, actually in the foundations of quantum physics, which I think is underestimated. He did this famous EPR paper, which is probably one of the most cited papers now. But at the time, I don't think that it was very much appreciated. But I think there he still had very deep intuitions. Right? He had very deep intuitions. Even if he was not right, maybe, right? But he just believed that the world must be local, in and over. And he clearly showed that, if the world is local, then quantum physics can't be complete. That's quite simple. And this was a deep insight. It was the wrong premise, but it was a deep insight.
Brought to a head with the famous Bohr-Einstein debates, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. But he actually localized gravity in a way. That was his big achievement. Newtonian gravity is deeply non-local. And Newton knew that. He knew that very well, that he did not give a cause for gravity. He even writes it in his Scholium. He didn't give a cause for gravity. He found a law. which tells you how planets orbit around the sun, right? But he never pretended to have found a cause for gravity. And he knew that the gravitational law which he wrote down was deeply non-local. And Leibniz objected and reproached him for that. But I think Newton was very honest. He never pretended anything else. And Einstein tried to localize gravity in a way. And so, of course, he could not accept that now quantum physics should again be non-local. That was certainly not what he could accept and what he wanted. So he opposed it. Right? He opposed it. As we know today, he was most likely he was not correct. He was not correct.
So you said something interesting about how Newton didn't understand the cause of gravity. He just wrote down this general law. And I've been nurturing a suspicion that that's actually a much more common problem than just Newton, where it feels like this has been, since Newton made that shortcut, it has been the way that we go about doing physics. I say we in the most casual way possible. Royal we.
Humans.
Humans, yeah.
Yes. I mean, here we are in the midst of this discussion about foundations, where you think, what's actually the ontology of it all, right? Well, it's very deep. I mean, what are we talking about?
Mm.
I mean,
And what's our goal? Like, what's the fundamental goal? Because it seems deeply technologically rooted. Like, if, like I said, your goal is to make predictions, you can do that really well without actually understanding the physical reality of the situation. And we've been extraordinarily productive as a species in terms of, manipulating all of these physical systems with these laws, like you say. Despite and kind of just moving on, right? Newton, super famous, like you said, he was very open about not having a cause of gravity, but it didn't really matter because it allowed people to calculate how different bodies should behave in the celestial sphere all of a sudden, and that was magnificent. And he scaled Kepler's laws with this concept of mass too for the first time, which was also brilliant, and it got people closer. Got people closer to a physical cause, right? Because now it's like, okay, now the number and the quality of the atoms matters in terms of how much gravity is being produced, or how much attractive pull is being produced. So you're getting closer. Maybe he didn't nail it on the head, but he's moving the ball down the field in that sense.
Were you preoccupied with this when you were doing your postdoctoral work?
No, it's quite interesting. I had, when I was still studying here in Switzerland, I had all the courses, quantum field theory, quantum chromodynamics, all the stuff. I learned it. I could manipulate it very well, but I was never confronted with any ontological question. So what does it really represent? Nor, I must admit, came into my mind. So I don't reproach the professors. But certainly no professor whom I could remember would ever have addressed these issues, right? What's a wave function? It's just a tool. And as you rightly said, you just calculate and it gives you the right predictions. And that's what we do. We do experiments and we test things and we need predictions and then we test the predictions. That's what I learned. And only when I was much older, when I actually resumed after my me having left the academic world, when I resumed research and my interest in physics, I started getting really interested in these questions. Maybe it's a sign of age, I don't know, but I was not aware of it. I'm not made aware when I was young. No.
Well, it's a difficult thing to find value in if it's not intuitive to you initially. Like, one of my good buddies in grad school was in the physics department, and we were collaborating on this biophysical project together. And I started to become interested in these questions right around when I was finishing my PhD, particularly because I had to teach an intro. I took a job teaching these international high school students basic physics one summer. because I actually just wanted some extra money, and I thought it would be a good chance to brush up on my physics skills. And that was the first time where I was confronted with the fact that I couldn't explain to them how a magnet worked in any kind of mechanical terms, and that absolutely disturbed me to no end. But I discovered that so many of the other basic things that like everything in our daily life, from light to why we stick to the floor to magnetism and electricity, I couldn't do it. Like, I could give them the equations, of course, but I couldn't explain it in the way that I was used to working in biophysical systems, where I'm doing elastic mechanics of various polymers and so forth. There's very easy to represent ideas at play. And I couldn't do it. And so I had this buddy that I was working with all the time who was taking all of these, quantum electrodynamics courses and all of this stuff. And I would be kind of trying really hard to convince him that it was a genuine problem. I'm like, this is a real, and he, maybe it was because I didn't have the language at the time, but I could not explain to him why it mattered. And so even when confronted with it, I think there's a certain type of person who just is like, it's very predictive. That's all we care about. And who cares what it means in terms of the motion of any materials at the bottom.
Where I saw it best explained or worked out was when I read the work of John Bell. There is this book, Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics, where actually it's a collection of his papers, where this notion of beable, right, a beable versus an observable, is actually introduced, and that's when I actually got. Well, I think when I understood what was meant by this, right? What's the beable behind? What actually do I describe by this mathematical operator? Well, you can see, I mean, if you say an electron is a distribution valid operator, no, I don't think it is. It's described by this mathematical notion, but there is something real to which this mathematical notion applies. It represents to some degree this real thing behind, and we should actually better understand what's the real stuff behind. I think that's what I guess physics should be. But of course, it is more in the tradition of natural philosophy. You can be in the tradition of say, yes, we want to do experiments, we want to make predictions, we handle these things. We know how to handle these things, and we don't ask these questions. That would be Copenhagen. Copenhagen, you say, well, there is a quantum world out there, maybe, but we'll never know, right? By the way, these people were positivists. They were deeply influenced by the positivist movement. That was typically positivist. Right? You say, well, you see, there is something there. We can actually measure it in classical devices, but we have no access to this realm. So we don't ask, we don't talk about it, because it's just metaphysics. Stop talking. That was the positivist account of the world.
It seems to have some overlap with rationalism versus empiricism to some degree, right? Where are you willing to introduce hypothetical actors that you cannot observe, but you could say if they did exist would be sufficient to prove out the theory that you're presenting?
Yes.
And again, people come down on different sides of that. It's just, there's almost two types of human beings, like people who are okay with that introduction of uncertainty, because I don't know if the hypothesis is true or not. Maybe we'll be able to figure it out. Maybe we can disprove it, but we're certainly never going to prove it. And then there's another person who's just like, well, since we can't address that uncertainty, let's just stick with the laws. Let's stick with the description of the phenomenon as precise as possible and move on. It's just so fascinating to me that people are so different in their comfort with these two different possibilities.
These are very fascinating things. And mind you, without wanting to deviate from physics, but there is, of course, we mentioned Kurt Gödel, right? And there is, of course, or this development in modern logics and set theory, which is puzzling to me and also disturbing to some degree, because there, what we found is that some major problems are just undecidable. Right? The continuum hypothesis is just independent of the Zermelo-Fraenkel axiom system. We learned that in the early 60s. Paul Cohen proved that. And since then, I think there is this deep question in that field. quite similar, by the way, to what we have been discussing in physics. Is the continuum hypothesis true or not? We know that it is independent of the Zermelo-Fraenkel system, but there must be some axiomatic system, the right axiomatic system out there, in which the continuum hypothesis is true or false, right? So let's look for the right, the true, the, I don't know, I'm lacking the words, for the true axiomatic system. And then there is the other side, which says, oh no, logic is a multiverse. You can have this model, and then you have a model extension, and then you prove that actually the continuum has the cardinality of Aleph 37. You can have anything. It depends upon what you like, right? And this is puzzling, because this is a debate which is no longer in physics, where you can say, well, we have a model. We have a model where our math must be tested, namely nature. This is now the realm of thought. And in the realm of thought, there has entered a certain pluralism suddenly, where some deep facts are in a way, arbitrary. They can be true, they can be wrong. You can add them as an axiom, you can omit them as an axiom. And as far as I understand the field, I'm no expert by no means, but as far as I understand the field today, there are these two actually schools out there. One school being more for the logical multiverse, and then the school still searching for the right axiom. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised. Kurt Gödel would have looked out for the right axiom, right? Whether to these people, the continuum hypothesis is either true or wrong.
What is the continuum hypothesis?
Well, it's the question what cardinality is between the natural numbers and the real numbers. Is there any cardinality between the natural numbers or the real numbers? Or is Aleph 1 the first cardinality beyond the natural numbers? Is it equal to the continuum or not? And the question is not answerable. It's not decidable. I think it was Kurt Gödel who first proved that it is consistent with the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms. And it was Paul Cohen who then proved that the negation is also consistent with the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms. So the continuum hypothesis is independent of the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms. And this is puzzling. By the way, this was the problem which drove Cantor, the founder of set theory, which drove him almost to despair, because he couldn't solve it.
There's a lot of depressed mathematicians in history.
Yes,
quite
yes,
interesting.
he couldn't solve it, and he desperately wanted to solve that problem. Now, of course, now we know why he couldn't. Right? He had no chance. He had no chance.
Okay, so take us from, you're in the academy, you're at Princeton most recently in this story, and
Yes.
then you take a pretty far 180 and move into, by the way, my buddy who was a physicist also in grad school also left and went into some field of finance as well. So this is a very common motif, I think. So I'd love to hear your story of that decision space and what your experience was departing. And
well, it was very interesting. First of all, why did I depart? Right? What were my motives? I think they were twofold. First of all, and that was entirely my mistake, I just could no longer find enough interest in these very detailed mathematical questions. I just could not imagine to spend my life proving theorems. I just couldn't. Now, this was entirely my mistake, and probably I was too narrow. If I had the courage to find another field or something else, but I didn't. So it was just the environment I was in.
Was it just alienating, or like you couldn't relate to people because your work was so esoteric or something? Or what was it about you couldn't imagine? You say you couldn't imagine.
I think it was just sometimes the relevance of these questions. And you know how it is. as long as you are a student, you learn every day. You will learn 50 years of mathematics almost, right? And it goes in big. And then you start doing research, and then you improve a theorem of a colleague of yours by an epsilon. And this is somehow, anticlimactical in a way. So I could just not think of spending my life there. And secondly, of course, I come from a family of entrepreneurs. My father was an entrepreneur, and the economy, right? There was a big, big world out there of companies, of politics, and it's just, there was much more beyond the walls of the university to me. And I just wanted to go there and make my experiences there. That's what I did. And I joined the financial industry. Specifically, I went into asset management, so money management, if you will. And I spent 25 years in that field.
Did you find yourself using any of the logical tools that you had honed while you were working in physics as you moved into the financial field?
At first, I did. I was actually doing some quant work in that field. And help them actually to build, a computerized way of actually translating investment ideas into concrete portfolios. But then I quickly moved towards the client side of it all. And I became a client advisor, basically. And I ended my career as the global head of distribution of the largest asset manager here in Europe. That was the end of. So it was a managerial job afterwards.
It seems like you just liked working with people at the end of the day. You enjoyed this face-to-face interaction.
Yes, I did.
Helping people kind of plan their futures.
Yes. Although I must say that, asset management, of course, has some mathematical background because you have all these theories in finance. And my mathematical training helped me a lot to understand all these things much better. Mm-hmm. I had no difficulties to understand the economic models, the macroeconomic models, which I had to learn. So I think my math training helped me there. But I did no longer do anything related to what I had been doing before.
What kind of congruence is there between the mathematics of economics and the mathematics of the physical world? Like, obviously, we see the natural log appear. Like, what do you make of these parallels that crop up in these different systems? Because, it seems like economics is such a synthetic, fabricated thing, but then at the same time, why would it have any relation to the physical world in terms of its overall architecture? It almost convinces me of its natural emergence as a genuine natural biophysical system at the end of the day. Did you see anything like that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Basically, it's a social science. Economics is a social science. And applying mathematics to economics means that actually you have to find patterns in social behavior. Concretely, in my case, you have to find patterns in investment behavior of people. Mm. And as you rightly say, the fact is, yes, there are always some times or periods where there are some patterns, and maybe you can describe them. But what I found out over time is that any model which is simple enough that it can be used in practice probably underestimates the true complexity of social systems and investor behavior in particular, in my case, underestimates it drastically. The models just don't, there are always some periods over time where a model works quite well, and then suddenly there is a regime change for some reason or other, and then the models just go wrong. And you saw that, or you see that all the time when you have a financial crisis. It's a good example, because most of these financial institutions, they employ plenty of mathematicians and physicists who do all the modeling of the risks. And yet, when anything happens unforeseen or out of the ordinary, it seems that the models do no longer really apply. and do no longer really describe the risks you have.
Hmm.
That's quite interesting. I think where mathematics has a much better basis is in insurance. Because there, I mean, risk is much more concrete, is probably much better handleable. You have better data sets, and they know how to price risk. I think there, the mathematical approach works quite well. But obviously, in investing and finance, it seems to be quite difficult. And then, there came these new ideas about behavioral finance, which in a way qualitatively describe investors' behavior quite well. Unfortunately, they're very difficult to model. How do you model greed? How do you model exuberance? How do you model? I mean, it's quite difficult. So these things are never. Well, let me say, it gives you a framework within which you can roughly understand. If interest rates go up, then this and that happens there. But it's more qualitatively. I mean, it's not predictive. The predictive power is very poor, very poor. That's my experience.
I was listening to a very one of these super investor types the other day on a podcast, and he was saying that the basic floor plan for his operations was something like be able to track when something interesting happens and everybody piles on it as fast as possible. But the trick is knowing when to get off the bus, basically.
Yes.
And
yes.
you can only really get your sensors out and try to make an assessment of what's going to happen once it's already happening. So you don't have this long-range predictive ability to look at something and say, we can just move all of our assets here because this is going to work out later. No, you have to actually see it starting to work out before you can jump on it, and then you can maybe adjust your models to figure out how long it's going to hold or something in the best-case scenario. But you're always in this process of catch-up, essentially.
And it makes a lot of sense that insurance would be something that lends itself to mathematical modeling pretty well, because these are relatively consistent and constrained environments that have been looked at multiple times. It has played out over and over again. And sure, there's the occasional black swan natural disaster, something of the sort. But in general, you're gaming against the steady unfolding of nature, whether that's the effect of smoking on lifespan or the likelihood that a house is going to burn down in a certain area. There's enough data that you can collect to be like, well, it's kind of like this always.
It's funny because my our physics chair in the department that I work in at the university recently left to join the actuarial department for an insurance company.
Yes.
This is proved out.
Well, I mean, there have been people extremely successful, of course, mathematicians going into hedge funds, doing quantitative methods, and have been extremely successful. I mean, I've seen many. The point is, ultimately, you're never sure whether it was luck or skill. You never know for sure. It's very difficult. But it's also fascinating in a way. It's fascinating.
It's kind of the temperature of the world in some ways, because all of these different forces play out across markets, and it's integrating all of the moods of all of these people that are making instantaneous decisions about what to sell or to buy. And so it really does feel like it's the pulse of the financial system is an analogy for the pulse of the society that it is reflective of.
That's very important. Give you an easy example. There are valuation tools and valuation, let's say, formulas. How do you evaluate a stock? Well, discounted cash flow. Oh, it's mathematical formulas. Right? It's fine. They are very rational. So it makes a lot of sense. You actually estimate future earnings and you discount by interest rates and you get a number. Then you compare to others. And finally, here you are. And recommendations: buy, sell, hold. Now, the point is, if I am an investor, actually what I do, I bet on the fact that all the others agree that this is a reasonable way of looking at the stock. Now, as soon as there are too many who say, no, I just don't believe in this valuation because there is something black swan, there is something else going on, or typically state regulation, right? Something, an external force coming in, and that suddenly it doesn't work anymore. So I'm actually not betting on a formula applying to a stock or something. I'm actually betting to the behavior of the others. This formula, right, of calculating and actually decision making is just a proxy. It's a proxy for the behavior of all the others. Because I just can't model the behavior of all the others. So I assume that they are rational and they accept the valuation model. If too many don't, if there is a regime change, I'm suddenly totally lost. And I've seen that quite many times when you have a quant model which does this, right? Which says, actually, I have to find out what the majority of the investors do or will do. Now, this is impossible. There are too many, and there are so many motives. Let's actually nail down a few parameters and believe that they also will follow and know these parameters, and they somehow play the game. And it's interesting, for a while, this might work very well. And then suddenly, something changes, and the regime changes, and your quant model goes totally awry. So then it's in a way, the math or the model or these tools, these mathematical tools, are proxies. And you must believe that all the others believe in them too. And then, it reflects their behavior quite well. Because if the valuation goes up, the other one will also say, aha, this stock is interesting, I buy the stock. As soon as that mechanism doesn't work, your stock valuation doesn't help you anything. Because you can't predict by that valuation what the others are going to do.
That's really unsettling, I think, to people in some sense, because of course we want to believe that these laws are playing out. We just had a conversation with an economist about the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, and he really did an exceptional job of making the case that it wasn't just about these subprime mortgages. They were a symptom of a much wider loss of trust that was happening between the banking institutions regarding all sorts of different stocks at the and assets at the time, and that this loss of trust has a tendency to amplify because people are then no longer willing to make loans to each other on the same basis that they were making it previously, and so of course it falls apart. It can break catastrophically, and there's something about the human psyche that wants to pin it on this one very specific thing. Like, okay, if we just fix these garbage mortgage bundles or whatever the heck it was, maybe then this won't be a problem next time. But his point was much bigger, that this is sort of an emergent lack of trust that builds up over time in a way that's highly invisible as it's happening, and that it'll be difficult to avoid such a thing because you don't know exactly where to look.
I do get the sense, though, that there's periods where these, you keep saying the regime changes. And I get the feeling that there's periods where the regime stays relatively stable for a relatively long time. And then you get into a place where all of a sudden things break in a way where there isn't a new set of algorithms that everybody has agreed upon, which makes things make sense again. And so what happened he was talking about in 2007, 2008, where the global financial crash basically ruined trust between all of the banks. And there used to be this London interbank offer rate, the LIBOR, which was the temperature of how much they trusted each other. And then it stopped working. And instead of trying to go back and figure out, okay, well, how do we fix the problems? He was saying that they just got rid of LIBOR, and so now there isn't a measure of how devastated the system is. And I think that what that's reflecting is that something has happened, everything is in chaos. Having an alarm blaring that everything is wrong is very alarming, and so they've basically switched into this chaotic regime, and we still haven't come out the other side of it with new quant algorithms that are stable enough to be able to
Absolutely.
make things go.
I give you another example. Debt, right? It's a big issue. $1 trillion, I think $1 trillion over 3 months or something like that. Well, that's roughly the figure which is added to the US debt right now. Now the question is, how much is enough?
That is the question.
How much is enough? That nobody knows. Just nobody. There's no model, no mathematical model telling you, well, if it's 2.5 times GDP, then it's enough. Nobody knows that.
And there's we've had a number of these alternative modern monetary theorists, economists on, who are essentially saying that you can have as much, you can have it forever, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and suddenly you can't anymore. There's one example which I always cite, and it's German Reichsmark in the early 20s, when they had the total collapse and the hyperinflation. You know what Germany at the time did? They financed the war with loans, right? Of course, treasuries, state treasuries. And they did that for 4 years, and nothing happened to the Reichsmark. And nothing happened. So then they had to finance, by these treasuries, even more debt. They had to finance the reparation, which they had to pay, especially to France, for all the damage there. And they did that. And they took more debt, and nothing happened to the Reichsmark. Then there came the moment where they had no longer, because they had to pay it in gold, right? Then they had no longer any hard currency, no gold left. So the French invaded or marched into the Rhineland, occupied the Rhineland. German government at the time talked and spoke to the workers of the large factories there and said, go on strike, protest against this. We will actually pay your salaries. And that was the moment where the hyperinflation suddenly, with a blow, started. It was this announcement where the German government said, we'll pay whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we'll pay your salaries. That was suddenly the level where investors did no longer trust the Reichsmark, and within no time they got into the hyperinflation. It can be any trigger at any moment where suddenly this, and you mentioned the word trust, where suddenly trust goes lost. And nobody knows before when that happens. But when it happens, I guess things go very quickly. Suddenly people don't want the currency anymore. Right? You want to pay in dollars, say, and people say, no, thank you. I don't take it. And that's it.
And that's very unsettling too. It's very strange to look at the money that we have, which is just these numbers and accounts, right? There's no physical representation of these things anymore. It's very strange to think that your entire worth, your purchasing power is tied to some, I don't want to say arbitrary, and not trivial, but still ephemeral.
Faith-based.
There you go.
It's
trust
very,
faith,
very
right?
freaky.
Trust-based.
It's
trust-based. Yes, it's very much trust-based.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's funny because it's written on the dollar. If anybody still has actual dollars, it says "In God we trust." And damn it, they mean it. It's like, yeah, we better believe in this thing because that's the only piece that keeps it rolling.
Yeah.
And it does seem like everybody's equally invested in this global economy in keeping it rolling. That's the one piece that reassures me. Is like nobody stands, whether from China to Washington, D.C., nobody's interested, to rednecks out in the country. Like nobody wants to see the dollar not work anymore.
I think China and Russia would like to see the dollar not work anymore.
I'm not sure about that, especially in so much as they're participating in global trade using
countries that don't have a lot of dollars probably would like to see the dollar stop working. In general,
China holds plenty of treasuries still.
A lot, actually,
they hold a lot of treasuries.
I think that's true.
I see the fact that everybody, it's kind of like mutually assured destruction kind of situation where nobody wants to see the whole place burn down.
It would certainly be a rational approach to somehow find solutions instead of, finding or seek confrontation. Because for that very reason, everything is so interconnected today. I'm totally sure it's in the best interest of everybody to find peaceful solutions instead of confrontation. I think that's my personal view. But
And that's a reassuring linchpin at the end of the day. I think it's kind of the best thing you can hope for from a game theoretic perspective. It's very reassuring.
Pardon the interruption, it will be very quick. If you're enjoying the conversation, come over to patreon.com. We need your help to keep the show running, and any support that you can give makes our lives infinitely easier and the podcast infinitely better. See you there. So we have covered your entry into physics. We have covered your diversion into the world of finance. You retire and you find yourself with time, and then you return to your first love, physics. What does that look like?
Well, after 25 years in the financial industry, I must say, even before the 25 years, I started getting interested again in research. My old love. And of course, I got interested in physical research in physics. And I started actually reading about the foundations of physics. That's how it started. As I said before, about John Bell and these ideas, mainly about the foundations of quantum physics. And suddenly I had the feeling that it was now, the time was ripe to do something else again. And I retired from the financial industry. Actually, to be frank, I semi-retired. I'm still on the board of a few companies, but I have a lot of time now, again, to do research and to study physics and mathematics, or mathematical physics, if you will. And my first approach was via foundations, especially foundations of quantum physics. I started learning and reading about these things. For the very reason we just discussed before, because I was deeply interested in what it was all about. And I suddenly realized that I had learned all these things years before, but I had understood it mathematically, but I had not understood it from a physical, ontological point of view. I did not really know what it was talking about. So that bothered me a lot. And the second thing was general relativity as well, because there I had done some work or related work at Young Mills. It is very similar. And my thesis advisor, when I got my PhD, he gave me a book, the famous book by Hermann Weyl, Raum, Zeit, Materie. Space, time, and matter. It was a classic at the time, and I had read it. So that started my interest in general relativity, where also, it's not so clear what certain objects really are, and what is space and time really. I started understanding that even this is not clear, not entirely, and there has been a long tradition and a long dispute about what space and time really are. And so I got into it. That's how I started and resumed work. Yeah.
And how did you find the transactional interpretation?
Well, actually, I found it about 5 years ago only. And it had a great appeal to me, because the point was, I was deeply bothered by the fact that the physical theories which I had learned so far, in a way, they were describing a world on a map. It was equations, and you could go back, you could go forth in time, right, back and forth, and it really didn't make big a difference. Sometimes you had to take the conjugate complex, stuff like that, but basically the thing was always reversible. And this is not what I experienced, right? I mean, probably most of us, we experience something else. We experience, I'm now talking to you, now the second is over. That's the past, and there is a future, and I get older, look at me, and you see it. And this type of, these events, this type of thing was somehow not captured by most of the theories which I had, or actually by any of the theories I had known. And then transactional interpretation came very close to this, because it was the idea that there were, events, things were getting actual, and other things were pushed to the past. And I also realized that there were these, causal networks, causal nets, and somehow the transactional interpretation is a type of causal net, and it gives you, in addition, also the recipe how these events happen. Right? It's by exchange of photons, and that had a great appeal. And then I also understood that this interpretation was somehow able to make sense of the Born rule. So there was a physical explanation why.
Can you tell people what the Born rule is?
Yes, the type. You take the wave function or the quantum state, and then when you want, that's an amplitude, and then you want to know what the probability is. So you have to take the absolute value and square it, and this is nothing else but you take the scalar product between the conjugate complex and between the wave function. And the transactional interpretation made that very clear. You had a wave going forward in time, a retarded wave, and then you had a wave coming backward in time. That was the conjugate complex, and they both had to somehow transact. You needed both to get something real out of it. And if you multiply these two mathematical entities, you get exactly the Born rule. You get the square of the absolute value of the wave function. That helped a lot. So I was very interested. Right? And I read all the books by Ruth Kastner and also by John Kramer, because he was the first one to introduce the idea.
And I should mention that we've had both of them on the show. I already mentioned Ruth. We had John Kramer. We also have had two episodes with Carver Mead, who wrote a fantastic little book called Collective Electrodynamics that makes the mathematics of this transaction, this explanation of light, very, very clear. It's very easy to understand, even for someone with minimal mathematical background.
Excellent. So it had a great appeal to me. I must say. And then I also read on the gravity side, I read the work of Erik Verlinde about entropic gravity, right, where he somehow derives Newton's law on entropic grounds. There was earlier work by Jacobson also, where he actually shows that the Einstein equations are an entropic state equation. Also interested me a lot. And I was looking for a connection between the two, whether it was possible to somehow combine the transactional view on the world with entropic gravity. And that was actually, or is actually, what I have been doing for the last 5 years. And also published a few papers, partly in conjunction with Ruth Kastner.
All right, so I really want to hear about the details of your theoretical work on this, but I do think it's worth prefacing this with the revelation that there is some surprising overlap between light and gravity, and that it might not strike people as revolutionary, but light itself is very difficult to comprehend without taking into account two different atoms, right? And so this was first announced somewhat heretically by G.N. Lewis, the guy who gave us a lot of the basic ideas we have about the atom and electrons, who basically remarked that, I don't think it makes sense for us to be talking about light without talking about an emitter and an absorber. And in so much as we only consider the emitter or we only consider the absorber, we're going to be missing a huge part of the story. Yeah. Now, I would hazard to raise the same issue with gravity, that it makes very little sense without considering two atoms at least, two pieces of material that express this concept that we call mass. There's something going on there. And, depending on how seriously you take this business with the gravitational waves and so forth, we're beginning to understand gravity to have some sort of wave-like properties that do seem to correspond. They're also transverse waves, which is very unique in the physical world. There's very few instances of transverse waves other than light and gravity. There's something, the polarization, there are issues here that seem to point towards a shared conduit, let's say, a shared some sort of shared infrastructure between the two. And so I think that I just wanted to lay that out as a preface for why we should even be thinking about light. The inverse square law is another great one, right? The intensity of gravity and the intensity of light falls off mysteriously with an inverse square. So there's just so many overlaps between these two phenomena, which in some sense are both as mundane as it gets, right? We use light and we experience gravity all the time, but they're also some of the most poorly understood despite being ever present. And so I really think that this is some place where we're going to see a lot of development in the future of physics, is the relationship between light and gravity.
Light and gravity.
So, maybe.
I'm right there. I'm right there. Yes. So, I made an attempt to somehow connect the two worlds. And the basis of it all is the idea, and that's, if you will, an axiom of this transactional interpretation, that by doing a transaction and exchanging a real photon, the emitter and the absorber get somehow localized in space. That's an axiom of that interpretation. And I just noticed that if you localize an absorber, say, particle, you localize it, you somehow erase information, because the particle has the possibility to be anywhere, a certain probability. You can assign to it an information measure, Shannon entropy most of the time. And if you actually localize it, you somehow erase all these possibilities. And now there is the idea that if you erase information, you always get, as a compensation, you get thermodynamic entropy as a compensation. So you erase information entropy, and you actually get thermodynamic entropy. And in case of the position operator, you can actually prove that. It's nothing else but a variant of the position momentum inequality. You actually can show that you get minimally the amount you lose in position information, you get back in terms of thermodynamic entropy.
Before we get too deep into this, I have found that when people use the word entropy, they often mean radically different things. And so can we just give a definition for entropy that we're using for everything that follows?
Yes. I mean, entropy is just, in a way, you can look at it as a kind of disorder, or you can look at it as the number of arrangements a certain number of particles can assume. And if it's a single particle, it's just the number of different places it could be. And it's always an average number, right? It's an average number, and it's a probabilistic measure. But that's probably intuitively a good thing. Now, what many places could it on average be? What allocation can it have? And then there are, of course, two types of entropy, if you will, because you can assign to any distribution, any probability distribution, you can assign an entropy. But of course, entropy, as the founders of thermodynamics understood, was momentum, right? It had something to do with energy. How many arrangements could you have in terms of momentum in a certain space? And that's why it is not automatically clear that the type of general information entropy, which is a term in probability, necessarily must coincide with entropy in thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is more specific. Namely, it's the distribution, the arrangement of momenta of particles. But in case of a particle, a quantum particle, which has an information entropy in terms of position, probability, you actually find out that the two are strongly related because of the position momentum inequality. The lower your position entropy, the higher your thermodynamic entropy, if you will. So they are really connected, and that's what happens. That's what happens. You have a transaction, and the absorber gets localized, so you get thermodynamic entropy out there. So that's the first step of the idea. Then there are ideas. They are not new. They have been out there for a long time. You can take a sphere in space. You can assign an entropy to that sphere. It's more or less the surface of the sphere. That's what you have in the holographic principle and all these things. So you get an entropy assigned for some reasons. You can actually derive one from the other. Don't have to do that here. You get an entropy for a sphere, which is the surface area of that sphere. And now you have the situation, just assume you have a mass or an energy inside. We have a sphere around that mass and that energy. Well, you have energy inside. You have an entropy on the sphere. You can define a temperature. That's just thermodynamics. Temperature times entropy equals energy. A formal temperature. It's purely formal so far. And you find out that this temperature has the property of being proportionate to the mass or the energy inside, and inverse proportionate to the surface of the sphere. So the closer you are to the center, the higher the temperature. The bigger the mass, the higher the temperature. So these two things, right? If there is a transaction, an absorber gets localized, there is energy being produced, or there's entropy being produced, and there is a type of thermal environment on a sphere of radius r around the mass, say. Now, just assume that absorption, the transaction happens on that sphere. So what happens is there is entropy added to the thermal environment on that sphere. Because you suddenly now, you have a localization, you get entropy, and it's added to the thermal, to that temperature on the sphere. By doing that, what you get is an energy gradient, because you can imagine the spheres getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You get an energy gradient pointing towards the center along the radius. And this energy gradient is nothing else but a force along that radius, right? That's what energy is, a force along a curve. It's work. And you find out, if you do the math correct, that's exactly the Newtonian gravitative force. You get the acceleration for Newtonian gravity. It's exactly what you get out. That's the idea, by and large, what Erik Verlinde did, right? He just did not relate it to transactions. But that's the general idea. And now with transactions, that's the nice thing, since you know by the position momentum inequality that you get thermodynamic entropy back if you localize. You also know that you get minimally the amount back which you lose on the position side. But it could be more. You could get out more. And that's very interesting, because that more means that Newtonian gravity derived by this process of an absorption or a transaction plus this thermal environment is a limit case. It is automatically a limit case, namely the minimal case you can have. There could be higher or a bigger energy gradient, and there could be a bigger force pulling you or pushing you towards the center. And that opens the way to general relativity. Because you are not just tied, you don't just get Newtonian gravity out, you get it as a limiting case. And what's also interesting is, if you produce more entropy by the localization, this only plays a role if this temperature environment on the sphere is meaningful, because otherwise it's too tiny to make a difference to the energy gradient. And when is the temperature meaningful? Well, if the mass is very large. That's typically when we today believe that general relativity plays a role, right? Large masses. So if the mass is small, it doesn't play a big role. And it doesn't play a big role if the radius is very large, because then the temperature is also low. So that's typically what we today do. We say, well, far out, there should be Newtonian gravity. Typically in a black hole, right? You have a black hole, you go far, far, far away, and it will be more or less the Newtonian gravitational law which you feel. It's how you construct a Schwarzschild solution, right? Because you say, well, the boundary condition far out is Newtonian gravity. That's how you smuggle in the mass. So this approach, this combination between the entropic idea of Verlinde and the transactional interpretation, not only produces the Newtonian gravity, it also shows you a way beyond. It says, well, there could be more entropy being produced than just the minimum entropy. So there could be a stronger force acting on that particle towards the center. But it only is important if the mass inside the energy is big and if you are not too far away. So you get more if you combine the two. That's the first step. The second step is then to get to the Einstein equation.
All right, let me see if I can make sense of this. So you have this transaction where some energy is dissipated from some distant atom, we say a particle, onto the absorber. And yes, you have a transfer of thermodynamic energy at the same time, which manifests itself as an entropic balance at that absorber. Okay. Now, how does that production of entropy at the absorber lead to attraction on behalf of the emitter?
Yes. Now, just imagine what happens is, if you have that entropy being produced, it is actually produced on that screen. And that screen is a thermal environment because it has a temperature, a radius r. Now, if you move that screen towards the center, you actually get an energy gradient. You get the temperature times this entropy production. And the gradient shows towards the center. It gets bigger if you shrink the surface.
So that thermal motion has I hate to do this, but it has a want to move interiorly. Yes. It wants to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's naturally what happens, right?
Very stupid question. Don't things tend to move away from high energy environments?
Well, it's just you have an energy gradient automatically.
You have the arrival of this new packet of energy at the surface, I suppose.
Yes.
And so it wants to dissipate.
Yes. And the closer you
go, a lot of reification going on here.
Top down versus bottom up. So we're basically assuming that there is something that is at the center that is interacting with things that are at a distance from it. And
yes,
it interacts most frequently with the shell that is smallest and most compact. And so
it just can't interact with any shell.
It
doesn't
can,
matter
but if the energy of the shell closest is highest, that means that there's more interactions there. And
not necessarily.
No.
Not necessarily. It just shows you that if you do the interaction, and if you move your shell a little bit inward, right, you just get the higher energy if the shell is a little closer to the center, and you have an energy gradient going to the center.
Is there a lower entropy at the center?
Well, yes, because the entropy of the shell at the center is always just the surface. You get the lower entropy, but you get the higher temperature because the temperature is inverse proportionate to the area of the surface. But the surface has a lower entropy, absolutely.
Do you think it's reasonable to approximate large bodies as point masses, where the mass is localized at the center? Because I've often, it's an interesting thought experiment. Like, is the experience of gravity actually really intense at the center of the Earth, or is it being pulled in every direction equally, such that the mass experienced would be quite a bit less?
I think it seems to be the center of the Earth, but you're absolutely right. It's an idealization. I mean, and in general relativity, it's even worse because what you do, I mean, you take the mass distribution, right? You go and you divide it, you smear it out over space, and then you take an equation and you see T sub 0, 0 is the mass density at every point. It's even worse, right? These are idealizations, I fully admit. But
And that might be inconsequential to what you're.
Frankly, I haven't thought about it, but it's just the only way I can make sense of it, or it's mathematically right now, is that if you just assume it's a point mass, or later you smear it out, right, and say it's just equally distributed within the ball with radius r, because otherwise you don't get mass densities. But yes, it's true. I mean.
Okay, so I think I understand like the dissipation of this entropy in your model, but I'm still not seeing how the emitter is being pulled.
Is it the emitter? Or is it the absorber? I think it's the absorber that's getting pulled.
That's an important thing, right? It's the absorber that's getting pulled towards the emitter, and the emitter is always in the past. So actually, what you do, you can say in that model that any absorber gets pulled towards any emitter of which it absorbs a photon at that very moment, right? And that's well defined because the moment at one point is always well defined.
So basically you're saying that if you were able to put together a system where you had, let's say, two atoms, and one was the emitter, one was the absorber, you would see that at the moment of absorption, the absorbing atom would move slightly towards the emitter?
Yes, towards the emitter, whose emission was in the past. It's important, right?
Well, the emission can't.
Well,
can we agree that the emission can't be in the future? Yeah, like I know that theoretically we have all this time reversibility, but let's.
I know.
I mean, can I try an idea on you? Because I would be remiss if I didn't put this question or this proposal in front of you, because I put it in front of everybody else we've talked to, and I've talked to Carver for many hours about this. But I understand that in the mathematics of general relativity, that space and time are somewhat indistinguishable, and that under the transactional hypothesis, we're talking about this time-reversed wave. But if we take the probability distribution of the particle, in this case the electron, which we treat in chemistry as the outer surface of the atom, as having this nice probability, we can deconvolve it into the probability distribution function, where we can say that the electron is found here, 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 or whatever. It's generally localized in this shell. However, the probability distribution function gives us this tail of the distribution, which extends indefinitely. So we could reasonably say that the surface of the atom has some probabilistic distribution, but that the surface seems to be extended with some probability into the distance. This gives us a natural way to attach an atom to another atom, such that we could say that the actual time reversal could be a spatial reversal, in some sense that the atoms are in fact linked spatially, and what you're looking at is not some bizarre time machine situation, but actually two atoms that are physically connected to one another by virtue of their electron shells having this distribution, whereas they can actually engage in the process of light simultaneously and both take part in that at the same as that process unfolds. And so I guess the thesis here is that time and space being inseparable, what we're looking at is not a time machine sort of event, but actually both atoms physically participating in the process through their extended structure of the electron.
It's an intriguing idea to actually tie it to this extended probabilistic structure. I always thought of this process, this transactional process, as not really happening in space and time. I think that's an important caveat. And I think that's where also Ruth Kastner, if I understand it correctly, differs a bit from John Kramer's idea. He has a very, let's say, realist type of view of what the transaction is. It happens in space-time. Right? It is in space-time. And I rather tend to the idea that no, it is not in space-time. It is elsewhere. And time at that level is a parameter. It's not the time we experience. It's not the time which, as we mentioned at the beginning, goes forward, makes me age, look old, which creates the past and the future. It's not that time. It's something somewhere else. So
it's almost an entropic definition of time, I believe.
Yes.
It's funny because when I put this in front, Carver was very enthusiastic about this idea. Kramer less so. It was kind of funny. He said he thought about it for a second and he was like, "Yeah, you could say that, but I don't see what it gives you." And it just reminded me of this crisis that we've been talking about since the beginning, where some people are perfectly happy with abstractions alone. And some people really want there to be some rational mechanism that they can actually visualize in their head. And so it's not to say that, either approach is right or wrong, but it is interesting how different people are when it comes to comfort with abstractions.
But I think it's something important to see that the quantum state, right? It is something which I think does not live in space and time. It's not living in space and time. Well, mathematically, it lives in a Hilbert space anyhow. It's important, right? So why should it be embedded in a background structure like space and time? I don't believe that. And I think many of the conundrums we have, like this non-locality and all these things, get easier if you assume that these entities do not live in space and time. And that's actually what the transactional interpretation says, right? It generates, in a way, space and time as a network of events. Not easy to really imagine, but I think it has a lot of appeal to me. And anyhow, it helps in understanding gravity. I think it also helps in understanding later that why the Einstein equation is a classical equation, because it's all about actualized matter. It's not about quantum superimposed states. It's all about actualized matter. So all these difficulties which you have if you try to do quantum gravity and you say, well, how can it be that a superimposed particle actually lives on the same space-time? You don't have a problem because the Einstein equations do not describe superimposed states. They describe actualized matter, things which have already transacted, which are real, which are local, right? Which or have collapsed or whatever you want to tell it. But that's very important. So it's not. There's just no way you should quantize the Einstein equations. They are classical. Sorry.
I mean, it strikes me, Wittgenstein writes about this a fair amount, but it strikes me that there is a terrible confusion between a few different things. One being reality versus something, let's say, that we can tear apart with something like the philosophical differentiation between objects and concepts, where there are plenty of things that are real that don't exist in the same way that my table exists. For instance, I love my wife, but you can't take that love and put it in a bottle and mail it to France, right?
Yes.
And so when it comes to discussing things like time or even this transaction, which is at best physically described as an event, right? It's some interaction between actual physical objects that could be said to exist, right? They have some surface, they have some localization, and they're engaged in some activity which we can describe now in this abstraction, this conceptual abstraction, right?
Yes.
And we can maybe move those around, but we got to be careful, because when you start, like I say, when you start putting love in a bottle and moving it around, you can depart from physical reality very quickly. And so I think this is something I think that's been largely overlooked, because when we parameterize things in mathematics, we're not so much concerned with whether it's a concept or an object at the end of the day.
Yes. And I mean, see, as soon as you believe that, for instance, light is, photons are flying through space somewhere, well, you're lost, because then already, I mean,
exactly,
with Feynman's approach to quantum mechanics, you have a problem, right? The path integral is suddenly when it doesn't fly everywhere.
And the language that we approach these problems with, it reinforces the crisis in some sense. The word particle, for instance, it really makes the intro student think of a mote of dust or something like that, right? Yes. It's the word that we're comfortable with but when you start to really push on the concept of a particle, you realize it's not a mote of dust. It has intrinsic angular momentum.
Yes.
It's something happening. It's an event. Yes. It's more like an event, really, than like a mote of dust. And so it's unfortunate that we call them particles, because it misleads. It has this very shadowy way of obscuring what we're really looking at, and that's unfortunate.
Yes. Of course, we are so much influenced by what we see, what we experience with our senses, and we see cars moving from A to B, but I think that's not really what's happening. And the idea of embedding quantum objects into space and time container just leads to these terrible contradictions and conundrum. I think it's not the right way. But anyhow, we are now at the Newtonian gravity, which we have derived. And but what's interesting with the approach, it points you beyond Newtonian gravity already. That's important. So you get much more out of it if you take the transactional approach as underlying these entropies, which then lead to the force, the gravitative force. I mean, by the way, you also understand why there is the equivalence principle. If it's really the case that the underlying process is electrodynamics, it's clear. I mean, you have inertial mass, and it's crystal clear that gravitative mass can only be inertial mass. You just get it out. The equivalence principle is an immediate consequence.
Yes, and Mach, of course, is a really wonderful player in this story in terms of understanding the network effect of all of these. But I think the reason that people are not embracing that approach to light and really to gravity, I mean, beyond the, beyond the equivalence principle, but really considering that there are a lot of atoms involved in any of these processes, and you have to really consider a huge network of atoms. It becomes kind of irreducibly complex at some point. It's very difficult to put your finger on a mechanism when you're talking about, as Mach did, every atom in existence. But even if you're just talking about your local tangential network of atoms, it's still a almost incalculable quantity of players involved, and it just becomes something that you find yourself unable to make definite statements about very quickly.
I mean, Mach did not even mention gravity. He just said that the fixed stars have an influence on any kind of matter in the universe and define the rest frame and define inertia, but he never said that it is gravity. That was Einstein. Einstein took Mach's principle and tried to incorporate it into general relativity and thought he had failed, but I'm not sure whether he really has. That's another question. I'm not sure whether he really has failed.
I appreciate that correction. Yeah, that makes sense though, because I suppose that is the legend of Einstein, of his initial epiphany, was this elevator experiments.
Yes.
Making the
I don't know.
equivalence between the two. Yeah,
It's like the apple with Newton. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm still a little bit stuck on this idea that the exchange isn't happening in real space. I've just been sitting here and thinking about it, where you were saying that the transaction occurs not in space-time, but in Hilbert space or somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, I tend to think of it that way. Also this non-locality, it appears that it is over space and time, but in point of fact, these particles live in Hilbert space. And if they have a distance, they have a distance in Hilbert space, if at all.
Well, it's like, does love happen in space? Like, do abstract concepts that are second, third order abstractions, do they live in a principal reality that you can bottle? I guess that's the way I'm looking at it.
Well, we're talking about events, right? And so if we're talking, something must be happening in space and time, right? Like if you take love, there you can reduce it to neurotransmitters, you can reduce it to a glance, you can reduce it to a smell, whatever.
I think of it that way. I think that this transaction, what it does, once there is a real photon being transmitted, there is the absorption event, and there is the emission event, and at that very moment, space-time starts to exist. The space-time interval, the distance, if you will, is being created at that moment. And then, the two localized particles or masses, yes, they do have a distance, but it happens at that moment where this exchange takes place. That's what I believe. It's not there before. It's not that the retarded wave and the advanced wave goes through space. No. It's when the transaction is complete, that moment, you get a space-time interval. And
because these things are measured, these things are defined empirically at the end of the day, right?
Space-time interval.
Yes.
Space is defined empirically. Sure. It's a measurement of distance. Time is defined empirically as essentially what your clocks are doing.
Yes.
And so how can you, if you're empirically grounded in your statements, then I think that he's right. That's the best you can do, is say that this network of measurements emerges at the moment that it's evidenced.
At the moments of measurement.
Space and time become a relational property of matter. As you say, right? You can it's a distance in space and it's a distance in time, but it's a relational property. That's where the two atoms, which you have mentioned before, always come in. It always needs two, at least, because otherwise you don't have a relation. So I'm rather with Leibniz, right? He was rather of the idea that space and time are relational properties of matter, and I think the transactional interpretation lends itself very much to that opinion. And by the way, there is another interesting consequence of it. If you really think of it, if it's true that the network of reality gets actualized by these transactions after the other, it's a network, right? That's how reality is processed forward in time. Then it becomes true that light is actually the clock, because every transaction is triggered by light. So it's this idea by Einstein that it is light clocks, right, which actually gives the rhythm of becoming. It's light clocks. And you remember there was this dispute with the philosopher Bergson, Henri Bergson. He was a famous philosopher in France, well, actually in Europe, on the turn of the century. And it's interesting, he filled huge audiences wherever he gave a talk. There were 1,000 people came to listen. So he was a celebrity at the time. And he had read Einstein's theory of special relativity. And he said, it's all fine, it's consistent, I understand. But I do not believe that the time I experience consciously has anything to do with the time you define by your light clocks. Right? These are two separate things. He was deeply of the opinion that there was a type of inner time and whose intervals he called durée, duration. He called it durée, la durée. And he said, look, I just don't. Yes, your light clocks are all fine, but your light clocks do not measure my durée, something else. There exists something else. And consequently, he was not ready to accept the twin paradox as a real phenomenon. He just said that's not the real phenomenon because my inner time has nothing to do. And Einstein, they had a public dispute, I think in Paris in the early 20s. And Einstein, of course, he said, well, you're talking of the time of metaphysics, and the time of metaphysics is gone. There is now just one time. It's the time of physics. And Einstein won the debate. Bergson lost it in the eye of the public. But actually, if you think, the idea that the time of your body, of your everything, is measured by the length of your curve through spacetime, this was a daring proposition at the time. He had no proof that this is really true. I mean, it took, I think, in 1971, there was this experiment by Hefele and Keating. They sent an atomic clock around the orbit of the Earth, and lo and behold, it went slower than the clock on the Earth. But up to then, it was not, to my view, it was a daring proposition of Einstein to say, well, time, everything that is time, your body, how you age, is just this light, this curve through space-time, which is nothing else but actually a light clock, which measures your time. But if you think of if the transactional interpretation were what nature does, it becomes quite clear that Einstein was dead right. It's light which gives the rhythm of becoming. Light clocks are really what time really is, nothing else. So Einstein was very, very right, but he was probably, it was not clear why at the time. It was not clear at all. It's very interesting. So poor Bergson, right? Poor Bergson. He probably had a point.
We've been meaning to read some of him. What's a good piece of work to begin for Bergson if we wanted to dig into that?
I think On Being in Time is the one.
That's probably the book about it. Yes.
Okay, we should check that one out.
I started that one recently, and it was he's a very poetic writer, and I did not finish it.
Yes, well, but it is a very interesting piece of history of philosophy, and I think again Einstein was right, but it was by no means clear and why. I think he didn't have the real argument why. But if transactions are really how things, the actualized universe gets into being, it becomes clear that light clocks are indeed at the heart of what we experience as time. By the way, there is a technical work that was published recently, I think, by Fletcher. He shows that indeed you can approximate any time-like curve on a Lorentz manifold arbitrarily closely by a zigzag of light clocks, which would actually again be an indication that transactions could indeed do that, right? Just get all these little transactions all the time. So that's actually what moves you through time.
So this is really interesting because it does, if I'm understanding you correctly, with the relationship of the light clocks that are detected versus what's happening in Hilbert space, that there is a place where time is not the same tick, 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 yes. tick forward. And so that does suggest that Bergson might have been at least partially correct in the sense that there is a different kind of time.
At the level of the Hilbert space, time is a logical parameter. It's just a parameter. And you logically need it because there is change, right? You have different states representing the same thing. You need a parameter, but it's more or less, I call it a logical parameter, but it's not the time we experience. It's something else.
Anybody who's waited in line at the DMV can speak to this.
Yeah.
We have these horrible bureaucracies in our country where you have to go periodically and renew your, driving registration or your driver's license or something, and it can be an all-day affair, essentially, just to, get a new piece of paper. And time, believe me, time goes extremely slow when you're inside of one of these black holes.
That's very true.
I can imagine. Yes.
So what's next for you? Are you pursuing? Are you trying to refine these ideas, or do you have new problems that you're setting out to tackle?
Well, actually, what have I done, or we done partly so far? I think we then, once you have this basic thing, you get the Einstein equations out of it. I derived the Einstein equation. Then I was able to somehow derive the cosmological constant, or say what in the theory the cosmological constant could be. And that's a recent paper which I published. This is quite interesting. You really get this dependence on the inverse square of the radius of the universe, which the Planck collaboration measured about in 2015 or 16. So you can calculate it and you get that dependence. It's quite interesting. So the cosmological constant decreases over time, obviously, because the universe expands. Then I could also derive the rotation of galaxies, which is faster than you would expect from Newtonian gravity. That's also a result which comes out of the theory. I'm now thinking about black holes and the Big Bang. That's in my mind. How could we extend this? What can we say by this? I call it transactional gravity. What can we say about these things? It's very early. I can't say much about that. It's not finished. But yes, I think the idea has proven quite fruitful. You get quite a number of explanations. You get a number of things right, and they just fall into your leap in a way. We can derive the gravitational constant as a function of the mass and the radius of the universe. So the Mach idea follows naturally from the theory. So it's one after the other, one thing after the other. And I think it's now black holes and the Big Bang, which I would like to think about if I have time.
What do you make of this James Webb data? And we had a gentleman on the show, this professor from Ottawa, who was suggesting that it might be easier to explain some of this James Webb data if we push the birthday of the universe back, to 26 billion years instead of.
Okay, that would almost double it. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, if I think of the transactional theory, just think of the following. Actually, the universe starts with the first transaction. And
definitionally,
Yes, definitionally. And then you get a network, like a tree of further transactions, right? Over time. It just grows. But there could be another transaction not related to the first. I call it the connected component, right? So you get the connected component of trees. There could be another transaction with another tree, not connected to the first one, not at all. They just merge when the first absorption in the first connected component happens by an emitter from the second connected component.
So now, like a fertilization of some soil by an existing universe somewhere.
Yes. It's not a multiverse, it's one universe, but it's different connected components which build up by transactions. And it might happen that the emitter actually lives in a connected component which is much older. And suddenly you see by your Space Webb Telescope, you receive light, and what do you see? You see a structure which is actually developed much further than it could possibly be given the age of your connected component. I think it could be an indication that there are these connected components. I wouldn't call it a multiverse per se, but I would call it a different connected components of transactions. And yes,
I really like that because, my students, when I teach the Big Bang, it's often an objection like, well, what was before the Big Bang, It seems like a very reasonable elementary question to ask, and it's very difficult for people to imagine existence itself beginning.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about essentially our observations, our empirical definitions of reality as being transactions, defined by transactions, then you're talking about not the birth of existence with this Big Bang. You're talking about this moment in which this chain of events was set off, and so you kind of remove yourself from that paradox, which is
absolutely
it's clever. I like it.
And we should never forget, coming back to quantum states, there are quantum states without any space-time indexing. I mean, the vacuum. It's just a quantum state, just lives in hyperspace. It's maximally entangled, probably, or whatever, but it has no index by any space and time, coordinates, parameters. You can think of a spin state, spin up, Z spin up, standalone. Where is it? It's just a spin up state, and people write it down, and they tensor product it with another. But this spin state is obviously, even on your mathematical, in your math, it's nowhere, right? Only if you attach it to something which measures the spin, then suddenly it gets located. But before that, it's just nowhere, or it's in Hilbert space, but not in space-time. So
I think there could be a whole other sea of people like yourself and Kastner and Carver and Kramer who are devoted towards some sort of interpretation of spin states. I think that would be a ripe field for development as far as interpretations of quantum mechanics goes.
Well, I'm saying we should not be too surprised that probably space-time is not a theater with a beginning, right?
Nice.
Yes, there was a beginning of events, but there is a reality beyond this, or beneath, I don't know, right? But there's another reality, and it's as real as anything else, but it's just not in space-time.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
That might be a good place to put a pin in this conversation for now. That's a lot to chew on.
Excellent. Thank you.
Where would people, if they want to read more of your work, where's the best place to do that? Do you happen to have a website or anything like that? Do you do social media, anything like that?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I think you have to Google me, and then you find it's all open access.
Great, perfect.
It's all open access. You find it, and you find it on ResearchGate. There's a list of most publications, and we are thinking of writing a book. Ruth and I, maybe.
Cool.
A book-like thing about where we put everything together, so you find it in one place instead of scattered all around journals. That's maybe a project we are also on. Yes.
Very cool.
Cool. Well, maybe once you get that book out, maybe we can get you the two of you to come back and promote that book once it comes out. It'd be really cool to sit down with both of you. Yeah.
With pleasure if it happens. Yes.
Yeah.
With pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andreas. It's been a really good chat today, and I think people are going to really enjoy this. And yeah, I like the idea of approaching these long-standing problems with a completely new and open mind about the solution set, which frees us from any level of paradoxes. I think is moving us in the right direction. So, Thank you. I salute your efforts, and
thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye, everybody.